1Q84 by Haruki Murakami, Book 2, Chapter 24. Tengo. As long as the warmth remains. Tengo took a morning special express train from Tokyo Station to Tateyama, changed there to a local, and rode it as far as Chikura. The morning was clear and beautiful. There was no wind, and there was hardly a wave to be seen on the ocean. Summer was long gone. He wore a long, thin cotton jacket over a short-sleeved shirt, which turned out to be exactly right for the weather. Without bathers, the seaside town was surprisingly deserted and quiet, like a real town of cats, Tengo thought. He had a simple lunch by the station and took a taxi to the sanatorium, arriving just after 1 o'clock. The same middle-aged nurse greeted him at the reception desk. The woman had taken his phone call the night before. Nurse Tamura. She remembered Tengo and was somewhat friendlier than she had been the first time, even managing a little smile, perhaps influenced by Tengo's nicer outfit. She guided Tengo first to the lunchroom and poured him a cup of coffee. "Please, wait here. The doctor will come to see you," she said. 10 minutes later, his father's doctor appeared, drying his hands with a towel. Flecks of white were beginning to appear among the stiff hairs of his head. He was probably around 50. He was not wearing a white jacket, as if he had just completed some task. Instead, he wore a grey sweatshirt, matching grey sweatpants, and an old pair of jogging shoes. He was well built and looked less like a doctor than a college sports coach who had never been able to rise past Division 2. The doctor told Tengo pretty much the same thing he had said on the phone the night before. Judging from his expression and his words, he seemed genuinely saddened when he said, "I'm sorry to say, there is almost nothing we can do for him medically at this point. The only thing left to do is let him hear his son's voice. It might enhance his will to live." "Do you think he can hear what people say?" Tengo asked. The doctor frowned thoughtfully as he sipped his lukewarm green tea. "To tell you the truth, not even I know the answer to that. Your father is in a coma. He shows absolutely no physical response when we speak to him. There have been cases, though, where someone in a deep coma has been able to hear people talking, and sometimes even understand what was being said. But you can't tell by looking at them." "No, we can't. I can stay here until 6:30 tonight," Tengo said. "I'll sit with him all day and talk to him as much as possible. Let's see if it does any good. Please let me know if he shows any kind of reaction," the doctor said. "I'll be around here somewhere." A young nurse showed Tengo to his father's room. She wore a name badge that read Adachi. His father had been moved to a private room in the new wing, the wing for more serious patients. In other words, the gears had advanced one more notch. There was nowhere else to move after this. It was a drab little room, long and narrow, and more than half filled by the bed. Beyond the window stretched the pine woods that acted as a windbreak. The dense grove looked like a wall, separating the sanatorium from the vitality of the real world. The nurse went out, leaving Tengo alone with his father, who lay on his back, sound asleep. Tengo sat on a small wooden stool by the bed and looked at his father. Near the head of the bed stood an intravenous feeding device, the liquid in its plastic bag being sent into a vein in his father's arm through a tube. A catheter had been inserted to catch urine, surprisingly little of which had been collected. His father seemed to have shrunk another size or two since the month before. His emaciated cheeks and chin wore perhaps 2 days' growth of white beard. His father had always had sunken eyes, but now they were more deeply set than ever. Tango couldn't help wondering if it might be necessary to pull the eyeballs up from their holes with some kind of medical device. His eyelids were tightly shut at the bottoms of those cavern-like lowered shutters, and his mouth was slightly open. Tango couldn't hear his father's breathing, but bringing his ear close, he could feel the slight movement of air. Life was being quietly maintained there at a minimal level. The doctor's words on the phone last night, like a train dropping its speed little by little as it begins to stop, began to feel terribly real to Tango. This father train was gradually lowering its speed, waiting for its momentum to run down, and preparing to come to a quiet stop in the middle of an empty prairie. At least, there was no longer a single passenger aboard, no one to raise a complaint even if the train came to a halt. That was the only salvation. Tango felt he ought to start talking to his father, but he did not know what he should say, how he should say it, or what tone of voice to use. "All right, say something," he told himself, but no meaningful words came to mind. "Father," he ventured in a whisper, but no words followed. He got up from the stool, approached the window, and looked at the well-tended lawn and garden and the sky stretching high above the pine woods. A solitary crow sat perched on a large antenna, glaring at the area with disdain as it caught the sunlight. A combination transistor radio alarm clock had been placed near the head of the bed, but his father required neither of its functions. "It's me, Tango. I just came from Tokyo. Can you hear me?" he said, standing at the window, looking down at his father, who did not respond at all. After vibrating in the air for a moment, the sound of his voice was absorbed without a trace by the void that had come to occupy the room. "This man is trying to die," Tango thought. He could tell by looking at the deeply sunken eyes. He made up his mind to end his life, and then he closed his eyes and went into a deep sleep. No matter what I say to him, no matter how much I try to rouse him, it will be impossible to overturn his resolution. Medically speaking, he was still alive, but life had already ended for this man. He no longer had the reason or the will to continue to struggle. All that Tango could do was respect his father's wishes and let him die in peace. The look on his face was utterly tranquil. He did not seem to be suffering at all. As the doctor had said on the phone, that was one salvation. Still, Tango had to speak to his father, if only because he had promised the doctor that he would do so. The doctor seemed to be caring for his father with genuine warmth. Secondly, there was the question of what he thought of as courtesy. Tango had not had a full-fledged conversation with his father for a very long time, not even small talk. The truth was that Tango had probably been in middle school the last time they had had a real conversation. Tango hardly ever went near their home after that, and even when he had some business that required him to go to the house, he did his best to avoid seeing his father. Now, having made a de facto confession to Tango that he was not his real father, the man could lay down his burden at last. He looked in some way relieved. That means that each of us was able to lay down his burden at the last possible moment. Here was the man who had raised Tango as his own son, listing him as such in the family register despite the absence of blood ties, and raising him until he was old enough to fend for himself. I owe him that much. I have some obligation to tell him how I lived my life thus far, as well as some other thoughts I've had in the course of living that life, Tango thought. No, it's not so much an obligation as a courtesy. It doesn't matter if the things I am saying reach his ears, or whether telling him serves any purpose. Tango sat on the stool by the bed once again and began to narrate a summary of his life to date, beginning from the time he left the house and started living in the judo dorm when he entered high school. From that time onward, he and his father had lost nearly all points of contact, creating a situation in which neither had the least concern for what the other was doing. Tango felt he should probably fill in such a large vacuum as best as he could. Ultimately, however, there was almost nothing for Tango to tell about his life in high school. He had entered a private school in Chiba Prefecture that had a strong reputation for its judo program. He could easily have gotten into a better school, but the conditions offered him by that school were the best. They waived his tuition and allowed him to live in the dormitory, providing him with 3 meals a day. Tango became a star member of the judo team. Studied between practice sessions, he could maintain some of the highest grades in his class without having to study too hard. And he earned extra money during vacations by doing assorted manual labor with his teammates. With so much to do, he found himself pressed for time day after day. There was little to say about his 3 years of high school, other than that it was a busy time for him. It had not been especially enjoyable, nor had he made any close friends. He never liked school, which had a lot of rules. He did what he had to do to get along with his teammates, but they weren't really on the same wavelength. In all honesty, Tango never once felt totally committed to judo as a sport. He needed to win in order to support himself, so he devoted a lot of energy to practice in order not to betray others' expectations. It was less a sport to him than a practical means of survival, a job. He spent the 3 years of high school wanting to graduate so that he could begin living a more serious life as soon as possible. Even after entering college, however, he continued with judo, living basically the same life as before. Keeping up his judo meant he could live in the dormitory and thus be spared any difficulty in finding a place to sleep or food to eat, minimal though it was. He also received a scholarship, though it was nowhere nearly enough to get by on. His major was mathematics, of course. He studied fairly hard and earned good grades in college too. His advisor even urged him to continue into graduate school. As he advanced into the 3rd year and then the 4th year of college, however, his passion for mathematics as an academic discipline rapidly cooled. He still liked mathematics as much as ever, but he had no desire to make a profession of research in the field. It was the same as it had been with judo. It was fine as an amateur endeavor, but he had neither the personality nor the drive to stake his whole life on it, which he well knew. As his interest in mathematics waned and his college graduation drew near, his reasons for continuing judo evaporated, and he had no idea what path he should next pursue. His life seemed to lose its center of gravity, not that he had ever really had one, but up to that point, other people had placed certain demands and expectations upon him, and responding to them had kept him busy. Once those demands and expectations disappeared, however, there was nothing left worth talking about. His life had no purpose. He had no close friends. He was drifting and unable to concentrate his energies on anything. He had a number of girlfriends during his college years and a lot of sexual experience. He was not handsome in the usual sense. He was not a particularly sociable person, nor was he especially amusing or witty. He was always hard up for money and wasn't at all stylish. But just as the smell of certain kinds of plants attracts moths, Tenga was able to attract certain kinds of women, and very strongly at that. He discovered this fact around the time he turned 20, which was just about the time he began losing his enthusiasm for mathematics as an academic discipline. Without doing anything about it himself, he always had women who were interested enough to take the initiative in approaching him. They wanted him to hold them in his big arms, or at least they never resisted when he did so. He couldn't understand how this worked at first and reacted with a good deal of confusion, but eventually he got the hang of it and learned how to exploit this ability, after which Tenga was rarely without a woman. He never had a positive feeling of love toward any of them, however. He just went with them and had sex with them. They filled each other's emptiness. Strange as it may seem, he never once felt a strong emotional attraction to any of the women who had a strong emotional attraction to him. Tengo recounted these developments to his unconscious father, choosing his words slowly and carefully at first, more smoothly as time went by, and finally with some passion. He even spoke as honestly as he could about sexual matters. There's no point getting embarrassed about such things now, he told himself. His father lay face up, unmoving, his deep sleep unbroken, his breathing unchanged. A nurse came before 3 o'clock, changed the plastic bag of intravenous fluid, replaced the bag of collected urine with an empty one, and took his father's temperature. She was a strongly built, full-bosomed woman in her late 30s. The name on her tag read Omura. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun on the back of her head, with a ballpoint pen thrust into it. "Has there been any change in his condition?" she asked Tengo, while recording numbers to a clipboard with a ballpoint pen. "None at all. He's been fast asleep the whole time," Tengo said. "Please push that button if anything happens," she said, pointing toward the call switch hanging over the head of the bed. Then she shoved the ballpoint pen back into her hair. "I see." Shortly after the nurse went out, there was a quick knock on the door, and bespectacled Nurse Tamura poked her head in. "Would you like to have a bite to eat? You could go to the lunchroom." "Thanks, but I'm not hungry," Tengo said. "How's your father doing?" Tengo nodded. "I've been talking to him the whole time. I can't tell whether he can hear me or not." "It's good to keep talking to them," she said. She smiled encouragingly. "Don't worry, I'm sure he can hear you." She closed the door softly. Now it was just Tengo and his father in the little room again. Tengo went on talking. He graduated from college and started teaching mathematics at a cram school in the city. No longer was he a math prodigy from whom people expected great things, nor was he a promising member of a judo team. He was a mere cram school instructor, but that very fact made Tengo happy. He would catch his breath at last. For the first time in his life, he was free. He could live his own life as he wanted without having to worry about anyone else. Eventually, he started writing fiction. He entered a few of his finished stories in competitions, which led him to become acquainted with a quirky editor named Komatsu. This editor gave him the job of rewriting Air Chrysalis, a story by a 17-year-old girl named Fukaeri, whose real name was Eriko Fukada. Fukaeri had created the story, but she had no talent for writing, so Tengo took on that task. He did such a good job that the piece won a debut writer's prize from a magazine, and then subsequently published as a book that became a huge bestseller. Because the book was so widely discussed, the selection committee for the Akutagawa Prize, the most prestigious literary award, kept their distance from it. So, while it did not win that particular prize, the book sold so many copies that Komatsu, in his typically brusque way, said, "Who the hell needs that?" Tengo had no confidence that his story was reaching his father's ears, and even if it was, he had no way of telling whether or not his father was understanding it. He felt his words had no impact, and he could see no response. Even if his words were getting through, Tengo had no way of knowing if his father was even interested. Maybe the old man just found them annoying. Maybe he was thinking, who gives a damn about other people's life stories? Just let me sleep. All Tengo could do, though, was continue to say whatever came to his mind. He couldn't think of anything better to do while crammed into this little room with his father. His father made the slightest movement. His eyes were closed tightly at the bottom of those two deep, dark hollows. He might as well have been waiting for winter to come and the hollows to fill up with snow. I can't say that things are going all that well for the moment, but if possible, I'd like to make my living by writing, not just rewriting somebody else's work, but writing what I want to write, the way I want to write it. Writing, and especially fiction writing, is well suited for my personality, I think. It's good to have something you want to do, and now I finally have it. Nothing of mine has ever been published with my name on it, but that ought to happen soon enough. I'm really not a bad writer, if I do say so myself. At least one editor gives me some credit for my talent. I'm not worried on that front. And I seem to have the qualities needed to be a receiver, Tengo thought of adding. So much so that I have been drawn into the fictional world that I myself have written. But this was no place to start talking about such complicated matters. That was a whole different story. He decided to change the subject. A more pressing problem for me is that I have never been able to love anyone seriously. I have never felt unconditional love for anyone since the day I was born. Never felt that I could give myself completely to that one person. Never once. Even as he said this, Tengo found himself wondering if this miserable-looking old man before him had ever experienced loving someone with his whole heart. Perhaps he had seriously loved Tengo's mother, which may have been why he was willing to raise Tengo as his own child, even though he knew they had no blood tie. If so, that meant he had lived a far more spiritually fulfilling life than Tengo. The one possible exception is a girl I remember very well. We were in the same class in the 3rd and 4th grade in Ichikawa. Yes, I'm talking about something that happened a good 20 years ago. I was very strongly drawn to her. I've thought about her all this time, and even now I still think about her a lot. But I never really talked to her. She changed schools, and I never saw her again. But something happened recently that made me want to find her. I finally realized that I need her, that I want to see her and talk to her about all kinds of things. But I haven't been able to track her down. I suppose I should have started looking for her a lot sooner. It might have been a lot easier then. Tengo fell silent, waiting for the things he had talked about so far to sink into his father's mind, or rather to sink into his own mind. Then he started speaking again. Yes, I was too much of a coward where these things were concerned. The same reason kept me from investigating my own family register. If I wanted to find out whether my mother really died or not, I could have looked it up easily. All I had to do was go to the city hall and look up the record. In fact, I thought about doing it any number of times. I even walked as far as the city hall, but I couldn't make myself request the documents. I was afraid to see the truth before my eyes. I was afraid to expose it with my own hands. And so I waited for it to happen by itself, naturally. Tengo released a sigh. Oh well, all that aside, I should have started looking for the girl a lot sooner. I took a huge detour. I couldn't get myself going. How should I put this? I'm a coward when it comes to matters of the heart. That is my fatal flaw. Tengo got up from the stool, went to the window and looked out at the pine woods. The wind had died. He could hear the roar of the ocean. A large cat was crossing the garden. Judging from its sagging middle, it was probably pregnant. It lay down at the base of a tree, spread its legs, and started licking its belly. Leaning against the windowsill, Tengo continued to speak to his father. But anyhow, lately it has begun to seem as if my life has finally started to change. I feel that way. To tell you the truth, I hated you for a long time. From the time I was little, I used to think that I didn't belong in such a miserable little place, that I was someone who deserved to be in more comfortable circumstances. I felt it was unfair for you to treat me as you did. My classmates all seemed to be living happy, satisfying lives. Kids whose gifts and talents were far inferior to mine were having much more fun than I was every day. I used to seriously wish that you were not my father. I imagined that this had to be some mistake. You couldn't possibly be my real father. There couldn't possibly be any blood relationship. Tengo looked out of the window again at the cat. It was still absorbed in licking its swollen belly, unaware that it was being watched. Tengo kept his gaze on the cat as he continued talking. I don't feel that way anymore. Now, I think that I was in the right circumstances for me and had the right father. I really mean it. To tell you the truth, I was a useless human being, a person of no value. In a sense, I'm the one who ruined me. I did it myself. I can see that now. I was a math prodigy when I was little, that's for sure. Even I know I had a real talent. Everybody kept their eye on me and made a big deal over me, but ultimately, it was a talent that had no hope of developing into anything meaningful. It was just there. I was always a big boy and good at judo, and I always did well in the prefectural tournaments. But when I went into the wider world, there were lots of guys who were stronger than I was. I was never chosen to represent my university in the national tournaments. This was a great shock to me. For a while, I no longer knew who I was. But that was only natural, because, in fact, I was nobody. Tenga opened the bottle of mineral water he had brought with him and took a drink. Then he sat down on the stool again. I told you this before, but I'm grateful to you. I believe I'm not your real son. I'm almost sure of it. I'm grateful to you for having raised me even though we had no blood tie. I'm sure it wasn't easy for a man to raise a small child alone. Now, though, when I recall how you took me around on your NHK collections, I feel sick at heart. I have only terrible memories of that, but I'm sure that you could think of no other way to communicate with me. How should I put it? It was probably the best thing you could do. That was your only point of contact with society, and you wanted to show me what it was like out there. I can see that now. Of course, you also calculated that having a child with you would make it easier for you to collect the money, but that wasn't all you had in mind, I suspect. Tenka paused briefly to let his words sink in and to organize his own thoughts. Of course, as a child, I couldn't see it that way. It was just embarrassing and painful to me. That I had to go around with you making collections while my classmates spent their Sundays having fun. I can't tell you how much I hated it when Sundays came around. But now, at least to some extent, I can understand what you did. I'm not saying that it was right. It left me with the scars. It was hard for a child. But what's done is done. Don't let it bother you. One good thing it did was to make me tougher. I learned firsthand that it's not easy making your own way through this world. Tengo opened his hands and looked at his palms for a while. I'm going to go on living one way or another. I think I can do a better job of it from now on, without such pointless detours. I don't know what you want to do. Maybe you just want to go on sleeping quietly, without ever waking up again. That's what you should do, if you want to. I can't stand in your way if that's what you are hoping for. All I can do is let you go on sleeping. In any case, I wanted to say all this to you, to tell you what I have done so far in life and what I am thinking. Maybe you would have preferred not to hear any of this. And if that's the case, I'm sorry to have inflicted it on you. Anyhow, I have nothing more to tell you. I've pretty much said everything I thought I ought to say. I won't bother you anymore. Now you can sleep as much as you like. After 5 o'clock, Nurse Omura, the one with the ballpoint pen in her hair, came to the room and checked the amount of intravenous fluid in the bag. This time, she did not check his father's temperature. Anything to report? She asked. Not really. He's just been sleeping the whole time, Tengo answered. The nurse nodded. The doctor will be here soon. How late can you stay here today, Mr. Kawana? Tengo glanced at his watch. I'll be catching the train just before 7, so I can stay as late as 6:30. The nurse wrote something on his father's chart and put the pen back into her hair. I've been talking to him all afternoon, but he doesn't seem to hear me, Tengo said. The nurse said, if I learned anything in nursing school, it's that bright words make the eardrums vibrate brightly. They have their own bright sound, so even if the patient doesn't understand what you're saying, his eardrums will physically vibrate on that bright wavelength. We're taught to always talk to the patient in a big, bright voice, whether he can hear you or not. It definitely helps, whatever the logic involved. I can say that from experience. Tengo thought about this remark. Thank you, he said. Nurse Omura nodded lightly and with a few quick steps left the room. After that, Tengo and his father maintained a long silence. Tengo had nothing more to say, but the silence was not an uncomfortable one for him. The afternoon light was gradually fading, and hints of evening hung in the air. The sun's last rays moved silently and stealthily through the room. Tengo suddenly wondered if he had said anything to his father about the 2 moons. He had the feeling that he had probably not done so. Tengo was now living in a world with 2 moons. It's a very strange sight, no matter how many times I see it, he wanted to say. But he also felt that there wouldn't be much point to mentioning it. The number of moons in the sky was of no concern to his father. This was a problem that Tengo would have to handle on his own. Ultimately, though, whether this world or that world had only 1 moon, or 2 moons, or 3 moons, there was only one Tengo. What difference did it make? Whatever world he was in, Tengo was just Tengo. The same person with his own unique problems and his own unique characteristics. The real question was not in the moons, but in Tengo himself. Half an hour later, Nurse Omura came into the room again. For some reason, she no longer had a pen in her hair. Where could it have gone? Tengo found himself strangely concerned about the pen. 2 male staff members came with her, wheeling a movable bed. Both men were stockily built and dark-complexioned, and neither of them said a word. They might have been foreigners. "We have to take your father for some tests, Mr. Kawana," the nurse said. "Would you like to wait here?" Tengo looked at the clock. "Is something wrong with him?" The nurse shook her head. "No, not at all. We just don't have the testing equipment in this room, so we're taking him to where it is. Nothing special. The doctor will probably talk to you afterward." "I see. I'll wait here. You could go to the lunchroom for some hot tea. You should get some rest." "Thank you," Tengo said. The two men gently lifted his father's thin body with the intravenous tubes still attached and transferred him to the wheeled bed, moving the bed and intravenous stand into the corridor with quick, practiced movements. Still, they did not say a word. "This won't take too long," the nurse said. But his father did not return to the room for a long time. The light coming in the window grew slowly weaker, but Tengo did not turn on the lamp. If he did so, he felt something important here would be lost. An indentation remained in the bed where his father had been lying. His father now probably weighed next to nothing, but still he had left a clear impression of his shape. Looking at that indentation, Tengo had a strong feeling that he had been left behind in this world all alone. He even felt that the dawn might never come again, once the sun had set tonight. Sitting in the stool by the bed, steeped in the colors of the approaching evening, Tengo stayed in the same position, lost in thought. Then suddenly it occurred to him that he had not actually been thinking at all, but had been aimlessly submerging himself in a vacuum. He stood up slowly, went to the toilet and relieved himself. After washing his face with cold water, he dried his face with his handkerchief and looked at himself in the mirror. Then, recalling what the nurse had said, he went downstairs to the lunchroom and drank some hot green tea. His father had still not been brought back to the room when Tengo returned there after 20 minutes downstairs. Instead, what he found in the hollow that his father had left in the bed was a white object that he had never seen before. Nearly 5 feet in length, it had smooth, beautiful curves. At first sight, it seemed to be shaped like a peanut shell, its entire surface covered with something like short, soft down that emitted a faint but even glow. In the rapidly darkening room, the pale bluish light enveloped the object softly. The thing lay still in the bed, as if to fill the individual space that his father had temporarily left behind. Tengo halted in the doorway, hand in the knob, staring at the mysterious object. His lips seemed to move somewhat, but no words emerged from them. "What is this thing?" Tengo asked himself as he stood there, frozen to the spot, eyes narrowed. How had this come to be here in his father's place? No doctor or nurse had brought it in, that much was obvious. Around it hovered some special kind of air that was out of sync with reality. Then it suddenly hit him. This is an air chrysalis. This was the first time that Tengo had ever seen an air chrysalis. He had described some in great detail in the novella, but of course he had never seen a real one with his own eyes, and he had never thought of them as things that actually existed. But what he saw before him now was the very object his mind had imagined and his words had described, an air chrysalis. He experienced such a violent sense of déjà vu that it felt as if a metal band had been tightening around his stomach. Nevertheless, he stepped inside and closed the door. Better not let anyone see him. He swallowed the saliva that had been collecting in his mouth, making a strange sound in his throat. Tango crept toward the bed, stopping when there was no more than a yard between him and it, examining the air chrysalis in great detail. Now he could be sure that it looked exactly like the picture he had drawn of an air chrysalis at the time he wrote the story. He had done a simple pencil sketch before attempting to create a description of an air chrysalis, first putting the image in his mind into visual form and then transferring it into words. He had left the picture pinned to the wall over his desk while he rewrote air chrysalis. It was shaped more like a cocoon than a chrysalis, but air chrysalis was the only name by which Fukaheri and Tengo himself could possibly call the thing. During his revision, Tengo had created most of the external features of an air chrysalis and added them to his descriptions, including the graceful narrowed waist in the middle and the swelling round decorative protuberance at either end. These came entirely from Tengo's mind. There had been no mention of them in Fukaheri's original narrative. To Fukaheri, an air chrysalis was simply that, an air chrysalis, something midway between an object and a concept, and she seemed to feel little need to describe its appearance in words. Tengo had to invent all the details himself, and the air chrysalis that he was now seeing had these same details exactly. The waist in the middle and the lovely protuberances at either end. This is the very air chrysalis I sketched and described, Tengo thought. The same thing happened with the two moons. For some reason, every detail he had put into writing had now become a reality. Cause and effect were jumbled together. All four of Tengo's limbs felt a strange, nervous twisting sensation, and his flesh began to crawl. He could no longer distinguish how much of this present world was reality and how much of it fiction. How much of it belonged to Fukaheri, how much was Tengo's, and how much was ours. A small tear had opened at the very top of the air chrysalis. The chrysalis was about to break in two. The gap that had formed was perhaps an inch long. If he bent over and brought his eye into the opening, he could probably see what was inside. But Tengo could not find the courage to do so. He sat down on the stool by the bed, staring at the air chrysalis, while his shoulders rose and fell imperceptibly as he struggled to bring his breathing under control. The white chrysalis lay there still, emitting its faint glow, quietly waiting like a mathematical proposition for Tengo to approach it. What could possibly be inside the air chrysalis? What was it trying to show him? In the novella Air Chrysalis, the young girl protagonist discovers her own other self inside, her daughter. She leaves her daughter behind and runs away from the community alone. What could possibly be inside Tengo's air chrysalis? Tengo felt intuitively that this air chrysalis must be his own. Was it something good or something evil? Was it something that would guide him somewhere or something that would stand in his way? And who could possibly have sent this air chrysalis to him here? Tengo knew quite well that he was being asked to act, but he could not find the courage that would enable him to stand and look inside the chrysalis. He was afraid. The thing inside the chrysalis might wound him or greatly change his life. The thought caused Tengo to grow stiff, sitting in the little stool like someone who has lost their place of refuge. He was feeling the same kind of fear that had kept him from looking up his parents' family register or searching for Aomame. He did not want to know what was inside the air chrysalis that had been prepared for him. If he could get by without knowing what was in there, that was how he wanted to walk out of this room. If possible, he wanted to leave this room now, get on the train and go back to Tokyo. He wanted to close his eyes, block his ears, and burrow himself in his own little world. But Tengo also knew that this was impossible. If I leave here without seeing what's inside, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I'll probably never be able to forgive myself for having averted my eyes from that something, whatever it might be. Tengo remained seated on the stool for a long time, unsure of what he should do, unable to go either forward or back. Folding his hands on his knees, he stared at the air chrysalis on the bed, glancing occasionally out the window, as if hoping to escape. The sun had set, and a pale afterglow was slowly enveloping the pine woods. Still, there was no wind, nor could he hear the sound of the waves. It was almost mysteriously quiet, and as the room's darkness increased, the light emitted by the white object became deeper and more vivid. The chrysalis itself seemed like a living being to Tengo, with its soft glow of life, its unique warmth, its nearly imperceptible vibration. Finally, Tengo made up his mind, stood up from the stool and leaned over the bed. Running away now was out of the question. He couldn't live forever like a frightened child, averting his eyes from the things before him. Only by learning the truth, whatever that truth might be, could people be given the right kind of power. The tear in the air chrysalis was unchanged, neither bigger nor smaller than before. Squinting, he looked in through the opening, but he could not see very far inside. It was dark in there, and a thin membrane seemed to be stretched across the space inside. Tengo steadied his breathing and made sure his hands were not shaking. Then he put his fingers into the inch-long opening and slowly spread it apart, as if opening the two leaves of a double sliding door. It opened easily, with little resistance and no sound, as if it had been waiting for his hands. Now, the light of the air chrysalis itself was softly illuminating its interior, like light reflected from snow. He was able to see inside, however dimly. What Tengo found in there was a beautiful 10-year-old girl. She was sound asleep. She wore a simple white dress or nightgown free of decoration, her small hands folded on top of her flat chest. Tengo knew instantly who this was. She had a slender face, and her lips formed a straight line, as if drawn with a ruler. Perfectly straight bangs lay over a smooth, well-shaped forehead. Her little nose seemed to be searching for something, aimed tentatively upward into space. Her cheekbones stretched slightly to either side. Her eyes were closed, but Tengo knew what they would look like when they opened. How could he not know? He had lived for 20 years holding the image of this girl in his heart. "Aomame," Tengo said aloud. The girl was sound asleep, a deep and utterly natural sleep, with the faintest possible breathing. The beating of her heart was too ephemeral to be heard. She did not have enough strength to raise her eyelids. The time for that had not come yet. Her conscious mind was not here, but rather somewhere far away. Still, the word that Tengo had spoken was able to impart the slightest vibration to her eardrums. It was her name. Aomame heard the call from far away. Tengo, she thought. She formed the word clearly in her mouth, though it didn't move the lips of the girl in the air chrysalis or reach Tengo's ears. As if his soul had been snatched, Tengo snared insatiably at the girl, taking one shallow breath after another. Her face looked totally peaceful, without the slightest shadow of sadness or pain or anxiety. Her thin little lips seemed ready to begin moving at any moment to form meaningful words. Her eyelids appeared ready to open. Tengo prayed from the heart for this to happen. His prayer took no precise words, but his heart spun this formless prayer and sent it out into space. The girl, however, showed no sign of waking. "Aomame," Tengo called again. There were things he had to say to Aomame, feelings he had to convey to her. He had been living with them, keeping them inside for years, but all that Tengo could do now was speak her name. "Aomame," he called. He dared then to reach out and touch the hand of the girl who lay in the air chrysalis, placing his big grown-up hand on hers. This was the little hand that had so tightly grasped the hand of his 10-year-old self. This hand had come straight for him, wanting him, giving him encouragement. The unmistakable warmth of life was there in the hand of the girl asleep inside the pale glow. Aomame came here to convey her warmth to me, Tengo thought. That was the meaning of the package she handed to me in that classroom 20 years ago. Now, at last, he was able to open the package and view its contents. "Aomame," Tengo said, "I will find you, no matter what." After the air chrysalis had gradually lost its glow and disappeared, as if sucked into the darkness, and the young Aomame had disappeared as well, Tengo found himself unable to judge whether all of this had really happened. But his fingers retained the touch and the intimate warmth of her little hand. This warmth will almost surely never fade, Tengo thought, sitting aboard the special express train heading for Tokyo. Tengo had lived for the past 20 years with the memory of her touch. He should be able to go on living with this new warmth. The express train traced a huge arc along the ocean shore beneath the towering mountains, until it reached a point along the coast where the two moons were visible, hanging side by side in the sky above the quiet sea. They stood out sharply, the big yellow moon and the small green one, vivid in outline but their distance impossible to grasp. In their light, the ocean's tiny ripples shone mysteriously like scattered shards of glass. As the train continued around the curve, the two moons moved slowly across the window, leaving those delicate shards behind like wordless hints until they disappeared from view. Once the moons were gone, the warmth returned to Tengo's chest. Faint as it was, the warmth was surely there, conveying a promise like a lamp a traveler sees in the far distance. I will go on, living in this world, Tengo thought, closing his eyes. He did not know yet how this world was put together or under what principles it moved, and he had no way of predicting what would happen there. But that was all right. He didn't have to be afraid. Whatever might be waiting for him, he would survive in this world with two moons, and he would find the path he needed to take, as long as he did not forget this warmth, as long as he did not lose this feeling in his heart. He kept his eyes closed like this for a long time. Eventually, he opened his eyes to stare into the darkness of the early autumn night beyond the window. The ocean had long since disappeared. I will find Aomame, Tengo swore to himself again. No matter what happens, no matter what kind of world it may be, no matter who she may be. End of chapter.